Tonight we're going to ask the question, did Joshua fit the Battle of Jericho? Like the old kids song used to sing. Here's our timeline as we have been going through. We've moved our little archaeologist up a little bit, and now we are going to be still in the Bronze Age, but just at the end of the Bronze Age. And we're going to be moving into Joshua. After Sinai, of course, we're going to be moving into Joshua and the conquest, the southern conquest, and the northern conquest. Jericho, all by itself, though, has an immense amount of information. When you're talking about biblical stories and you're talking about the children of Israel, the Battle of Jericho is, you're talking one of the top 7, at least, especially when you're talking about the conquest. Now, this is a drawing. You don't have to worry about the words up there. I just wanted to put it in here so you could kind of get to see what Jericho looked like. You have the main city here. You have the palace over here. Over there. And then on the outside, you have a wall that's inside. But then you have another wall on the outside with homes in between. And this is going to come into play, with our story tonight especially. But this is actually a way that many of the fortified cities were built. And we'll deal with that as well and several others where they built homes in between these two walls. And we'll explain why. Jericho is an extremely old city. It's located in the West Bank region of the Middle East. It's the oldest continuously inhabited city on the planet. This city has practically, for all intent and purposes, it's always been inhabited by somebody. Now, we obviously know that that's not actually possible, but as long as they can figure, this is the oldest one that's there. It contains no less than 20 distinct layers. Now, I want to show you, remember, when we're talking about a tell is something happened here, there was a civilization, that civilization died out or was conquered, so they knocked everything down and they built another settlement on it. And then it happened again. And the further you come up the tell, the newer the age, the closer to our age. Well, they found 20 of those layers just in Jericho alone. It has the earliest form of animal domestication anywhere on the planet. Of anything that's ever been found, bringing animals together and farming, this is the oldest place that they found it. Now, the elevation is unique as well. It is also not only the oldest continuously lived city, it's also the lowest in elevation. It's 864 feet below sea level. There isn't any that's lower. It is the lowest that there is. Now, we'll move on. These are some of the things that they found in the as they did digs. This is a palace. By the way, you can kind of see the city around it. But this was a palace from the time of Abraham, around 2500 BC, and they found the walls that were coming up, and they did the dig. They didn't think anything was there, and then they found out that there actually was. As well as that, they also found something that's unique. Now, this is just a picture. You can see the city around it, and then this is the old Jericho, and this is actually where they did one of their digs. Kathleen Kenyon, remember I mentioned it on a tell. What you do is it's like a layered cake, and you would go in and you'd take a slice of the cake out, pull it all out, and then you can tell how old it is by the layers. And that's what she did here. And so you could just kind of see that. But you can also kind of see the shape of the walls from Jericho. But here, this circular thing with a hole in the center is actually a tower that stands 28 feet tall. It is the oldest tower anywhere in the world, although they may have found one since then, but regardless, it's number 1 or number 2 oldest. What's unique about it, that center hole that you see is actually a tunnel that runs through the center of this massive tower. Now, like we said, they keep building. So when the original city was built, this was ground level. And then they kept building on top of it when they got a new civilization and they came up. So now it's actually hidden from sight. You can see this is actually our group standing here. And this is how much lower this is from ground level. But what's unique about this little hole in the center, that tunnel, it's lined up perfectly with the sun, so that on the longest day of the year, the sun shines directly down inside the tunnel and illuminates this entire 28-foot tunnel and staircase. It's really neat. Now, because of that, some of them have said that this was because they were worshiping the sun and the stars. Some have said this was built just so you could look kind of like the pyramids, so you could look powerful and strong and rich. I have all of my money, so I can build this big tower. And then some of them also say that it was part of the wall of the original Jericho, and they used it for fortification purposes. But regardless, it's stinking old. It's literally ancient. It's been labeled the world's first skyscraper. Now, as you can see over there on the map, if you take a young earth creationist, conservative Christian stance, you figure that the world is somewhere around 6,000 years old-ish. They have this tower dated to 9,000 years old. So, although we may not agree with their assessment on the age, we can figure it's been here just about as long as everything else has. It's been here a long, long time. So that's neat. Oops, you're not supposed to see my notes. Sorry. Here's a picture of on top of Jericho now. The walls are down, of course, and over the last several thousand years, they have deteriorated with the weather. But you can see how far away you can see the city all the way around it. If you were to look that way, you would see Jerusalem. Well, you would see the area of Jerusalem, the Judean hills, the road that went from Jericho to Jerusalem, where you have the Good Samaritan story. It took place on that road that was going this way. Jericho was a very important city because it was very strategically placed. It's all about location, right? Here's Abel Beth-Shittim, where the children of Israel looked across the Jordan River into Jericho. Here's the Jordan River. This is the Dead Sea. When they came up from Egypt, they came up around the Dead Sea this way, and they came through over here. But what's interesting about Jericho, this massive valley that you see was a highway, was a road, and it went north and south. But also, you can see the road here that went east and west. So it was at a crossroads, which made it ideal for one strategy. You could see people, an army coming miles away. But for two, it was a massive trade route, and they became very rich because if you were going north and south, you went through Jericho. If you were going east and west, you went through Jericho. It sits on a hill. By the way, this is about 10 miles, I should say. It's about 10 miles from the Dead Sea. It sits on a hill, even in that little valley, so you can see further. It was a perfect strategic place to be able to take care of. The eastern border over here, this is the Judean hills that we'll talk about in a little while. This is the Jordan River. So it had essentially natural walls and defenses before even having to build a wall. It had its own springs underneath, even as low as the water is here and as arid as it is. Jericho is very fertile because it had its own springs, and you could just go dig a well and they'd have water pop up. So if you had someone that came to take Jericho, well, you just go and get down in your springs of water, and you didn't have to worry about running dry. Where the enemy, they had to go to the Dead Sea to start drinking water, and that was not an option. All right. Oops. Sorry. With my computer broken, I have to have all my notes in front of me so you get to see them. This is, number one, this is the Judean hills. This is the north side of Jericho. In the last picture, you remember seeing those greenhouses there? This is where the spies, when they left Rahab's house, this is where they went and hid. The area, not, that wasn't that spot, but this is the area, okay? Also, you see this little tower right here? You're going to see it come into play in a little bit. If you were to zoom in on this picture, close to where that arrow is, that is the mountain of temptation. That's where they say, and we don't know for sure, but that's where they say that Jesus, when he went into the wilderness to be tempted, it was on that hillside, okay? And there's actually it's a cable car that comes from the other side of Jericho and goes right over top of Jericho and then right up to the mountain, so you can see it all at one time. Number 2 here, now this is really hard to see, but there's a little white haze right there. I'm standing on Jericho and taking this picture. Right here is the Jordan River. It's within sight. And unfortunately, my camera's not a good one, but you could see it. Even my colorblind eyes, I could see it from standing on Jericho with all the walls torn down. So you can imagine being up much higher, looking down as you see the Jordan River at its full flood stage, and then all of a sudden it gets stopped on both sides, and 1 million people and more start crossing the river. They saw it all happen. Okay? This is the reason when you got to Jericho, the people were so scared, and Rahab admitted it, was because they saw the miracles of God right before their eyes. They knew who was on their side and who wasn't on their side. Right? Okay. This is an artist's rendition. If this is actual Jericho today, and this is if they actually had the city, how it would look. And even with this, you can see how much higher the city itself would have been than what's there today. So what was Jericho like during the time period? You see the rendition here. Jericho, and this probably doesn't mean much to you at the moment until you think it through. The root word is yar, which is moon. Okay? Jericho was one of the first cities to worship the moon god. You say, why do I care? Well, there's lots of moon god worshipers today. I want to ask you a question. Are they still at war with Israel? They are. You can see it on their flags. You can see it on top of their mosques, including the Temple Mount. You can see it even up there.
Quarter moon.
The quarter moon. They were moon worshipers. So Israel has been fighting the people that follow this God since crossing into the promised land, and it hasn't stopped yet. One of these days it will, but that's when the sun shows up and gets rid of the rest of them. Anyways, at best estimate during this time, and this is wild, there were only about 2,000 people that lived in Jericho. Now, just as in any siege, even in medieval times, you had lots of people, everybody important, the politicians lived up here, king and all that. Out here were the cheaper people, out here were the farmers, okay? When a siege took place, everybody ran inside to be protected by the walls. There was about 2,000, we don't know how many were farmers out there, but it wasn't that many. This was a time period when there wasn't the billions of people that we think of today. So there was only about 2,000, but they had enough, it was during the spring harvest of barley, they had enough provision to provide for themselves for an entire year, all of those people, which is pretty substantial. I showed you the 2 walls, and this is actually, he's one of the main archaeologists in all of Israel. He gave us a tour. This place is called Kirbet Kiafa. This is not Jericho. This is north. Now, some of you may recognize, if I were to say this little valley behind his head and up here, that is the valley of Elah. Some of you might remember that Bible story. When I tell you about the Bible story, you remember it immediately. The reason I'm showing this has casement walls, is what it's called. And there's a wall out here, and then there's a wall here. But in between the wall, there were actually houses. And people lived there. Now, like I said, they weren't the rich people. You didn't want your house here because when an attack came, guess who was the first target? You and all of your goods. But he actually takes us and he shows us the casement walls. And the reason I show you this is because this is similar to what Jericho had. In fact, Rahab would have lived in a house similar to this right on the outside of the wall. Now, I have a number 2 over here. That over there on that hill, we will talk about it down the road. That is where the Philistines camped. And every day, they would have a man that would come out of that camp and would come down into the valley of Elah and shout curses to the God of Israel. His name was Goliath. And it was down in this valley down here where David killed Goliath. He came from this hillside, and that was where the Israel camp was at, and now Kirbet Kiathal is there. But anyways, so that's all extra credit. I wanted you to see the casement walls. This is what Jericho would have looked like. And I did my best. When Dad did his, I gave him a picture, but it wasn't very good to scale. And I wanted to put one as close to scale as I could make it. And this is as close to scale as I could make it. This shows you what it would have looked like. But way down over there in the corner, that little guy that's this big, I made him just under 6 feet tall. Okay? This is the first wall that they would have come to. It was stone here, and then it was a red brick on top of the stone wall. Then there was an incline that was made of plaster. And on that plaster, and they had homes there, they could pour hot oil or water. It would make it very slick. And so the armies, if they got over this wall, would have had a terrible time coming up here while being shot by arrows and all kinds of slingers and all kinds of other things, okay? This is a 45-foot rise from the base of the stone wall to the start of the other wall that was 20 to 26 feet tall. It was massive and extremely impressive. Like I said, the hill that Jericho sits on is 100 feet already above the rest of the valley. Then you add these walls to it, you could have seen Jericho miles away. And they could have seen you coming miles away. You can understand why they would have been so scared of Jericho, the first spies. It was, for all intent and purposes, in human terms, it was impenetrable. It was a marvel of engineering at their time. It was amazing. Now, what happened was an act of God. The top I mentioned were red bricks, and this is Hazor, this is not Jericho, but this is what a red brick looks like. And you'll see there's bits of stone in there, there's straw running through it, there's rocks, and then they packed it with clay, and then they baked it, and it was red bricks. Problem is, over time, sun beats it down, what little rain they get beats it down, and they get destroyed over time. They're very weak. But they were on the top of the wall, so, why are you really worried about it when they're 65 feet in the air? What are you going to do? All right? So that's what a red brick looks like, if you ever wondered. So how well was Israel prepared? This is them traveling around in the wilderness. The Bible isn't very clear how well equipped Israel was. They had come out of Egypt as slaves. They ran for their lives. They did have a battle with the Amalekites, which I'm sure they would have plundered their weapons. But we don't know truly how well equipped they were. They were a bunch of slaves. We know they had blacksmiths because they found it in Arabia. They found some of those tools, etc. But we don't know how well they were equipped. But what about the army? How large was it? We know that there was at least 40,000 elite troops that marched in front of the Ark of the Covenant across the Jordan River. We find that in Joshua chapter 4, verse 13. But this was only a fraction of the army that Joshua brought over. 40,000 people is a lot of people, especially back then for an army. Remember, like I said, Jericho only had 2,000 people. Now, because of its defenses, they could have held out for a long time. But what does the Bible say about how many were there? This blows your mind. Numbers chapter 2, God tells Moses, as they're wandering around in the wilderness, to take a census of every man 20 years and older capable of holding a weapon. Now, it's one thing to have an army that's hired. It's a whole other thing when you have everybody. And that's what they had, is the army. So you go to Numbers chapter 2, and I've done this with you before, and we're not going to cover them all, but it does go through Numbers chapter 2. The whole chapter tells you what each tribe had in its people. There's 157,000 here in Zebulun. There's 154 in Issachar, 74,000. I mean, we're talking about a massive number. When you add all of those numbers up, it was over 600,000 people. 603,500 to be exact. That's a big army in today's world. Back then, that was practically unbelievable. To give you an idea, do you remember the story of the 300 Spartans at Thermopylae that held off the Persian army in Xerxes? They had somewhere around 300 to 800,000 people. Israel crossing the Jordan River looked like the Persian army coming against the 300. That's what it looked like. Can you imagine the terror that they had in their eyes, seeing all of those people cross the Jordan River? But besides just telling you how many people were there, I always love to do this because it's one of my favorite passages in the Bible when I found it. Good old Chuck Missler did Bible study. All of these armies and tribes are set and told where to plant themselves, to park their camps in relation to the tabernacle. They would have done it to perfection, exactly how they were told. When you take these numbers and you put the tabernacle in the center of it, that's what you see. Each one of these stars is 1,000 people. And you can do it yourself. You just make them all the same size. This is the north side. Can you imagine? They probably didn't know the significance of that, but we certainly do, don't we? They watched that group of 600,000 soldiers cross the Jordan River. Imagine the night before the battle. It's pitch black. They don't have lights on. The only lights exist are the campfires of that army. The terror. They parked there for... Say what?
It had to look like that.
It did. It really did. And they parked there because they had to have Passover, then they were circumcised, and it lasted about a week. We'll get into that. But can you imagine knowing what's about to happen with your 2,000 people, your family, your kids, and you're seeing that outside your front door? The mental anguish for those people had to have been astronomical. So here's a timeline that we are given in the Bible. And the dates are approximate. We know it was in the spring. Joshua mentions it. But then they also had Passover. And then they also celebrated first fruits. And that's huge for Jericho. Because Jericho was their first fruits celebration. But around March 27th, give or take a few days, it's the time period. They crossed the Jordan River. They set up the stones. The next few days later, they celebrate Passover in the plain of Jericho on the north side. 3 days later, Joshua meets the commander of the Lord's army. Remember, he sees a man with a sword. He approaches him. Hey, are you for us or our enemy? And the guy says, well, neither. I'm the commander of the Lord's army. In other words, are you with me, buddy? Joshua bows down to him, and we know that it's Jesus come in the flesh. And by the way, that kind of leads us to the question, did Joshua really fight the Battle of Jericho? We'll play into that a little later. Joshua receives instructions from the commander of the Lord's army to march around the city once a day. It would have taken about a mile around to march around the city. So from the 4th through the 9th, they march around the city, and that's in Joshua chapter 6, verses 11 through 14. Then on the 10th, on the 7th day, they march around it 7 times. With a shout, the walls collapse. Everything's destroyed but one home, Rahab's house. And all of the articles were destroyed with that exception of what Achan took, which we will talk about next time, and then what was intended for the temple. So here's the passage, Joshua chapter 6, verse 14. The second day they marched around the city once, and they returned to their camps. So they did for 6 days. But it came to pass on the 7th day that they rose early about the dawning of the day, and they marched around the city 7 times in the same manner. And on that day they only marched around the city 7 times. And the 7th time it happened, when the priests blew the trumpets, that Joshua said to the people, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." Now remember, this is 600,000. How many of us have been into a big crowd in a concert of 25, 30,000 people, right? That's only a fraction of how many were fighting this battle. And they shout, verse 17, "Now the city shall be doomed by the Lord to destruction, it and all who are in it. Only Rahab the harlot shall live, and she and all of who are in her house, because she hid the messengers that we sent." Verse 18, "And you by all means abstain from the accursed things, lest you become accursed," poor Achan, "when you take the accursed things, and make the camp of Israel a curse, and trouble it. But all the silver and the gold, the vessels of bronze and iron are consecrated to the Lord." By the way, guess what they don't find in Jericho? No silver and gold. I wonder why. "All the silver and the gold and the iron are consecrated to the Lord, for they shall come into the treasury of the Lord." So the people shouted when the priests blew the trumpets, and it happened when the people heard the sound of the trumpet that the people shouted with a great shout, and the walls fell down flat. Now we have bad translation. It literally means in the Hebrew, the walls fell out from underneath themselves. Then the people went up into the city, every man straight before him. Now I've got a picture in the next slide, and it's not right. It gives you an idea, but it's not right, and I want to explain why. Each person went up straight before them. They've surrounded the city, and everybody just went, okay? And they took the city, and they utterly destroyed all that was in the city, both man and woman, young and old, ox and sheep and donkey, with the edge of the sword, just as God had told them. So this is wrong, but this is what it would have looked like when the walls fell out. The walls fell out literally all the way around the city, and when they fell down, they created a ramp. And so what would have happened, these walls, they came down, and they literally came to these walls, and these walls came down, and it literally made a bridge, so all they had to do was just go up right in front of them. All except for one place on the north side. So then they burnt it with fire. Now I want you to think about this. Can you imagine being the people in the Judean hills looking down and seeing this glory, this Jericho, this impregnable city gone in a week in one battle? They felt completely helpless. This place should have lasted a year in a battle. They should have never been able to take these walls, and it happened in a week. And then, even scarier than the walls being taken, they burnt it to the ground. They didn't loot it. They didn't run off with its spoils. They didn't rebuild the walls. They didn't start living there. They burnt it. They said, "We don't want anything." Can you imagine what the people in the next neighborhood thought? The terror Ai had. No spoils, no survivors, complete conquest. They didn't come to pillage, but completely annihilate the people of Jericho. And you're looking down knowing you're next. All right, so assuming this is biblical Jericho, according to the biblical account, what should the archaeologists find? The city would be strongly fortified. We find that in Joshua, and I've got the the places here. Okay, it should be strongly fortified. The attack occurred around the harvest, barley harvest in springtime. The inhabitants had no opportunity to flee with their goods. The siege was short, but the city was not plundered. The walls were leveled, possibly by an earthquake. The city was burned after the walls had fallen. This is not archaeology. This is our biblical text. These are just points. Okay? So, what did they find? This is all of the digs that they've done. They've got different dates depending on which strata it is, but I just wanted you to be able to see it. So, what have they found? There's been three main archaeologists that have taken and done cuts. And I wish this was a better picture, but we took it on a sign, so it didn't come out very good. And then we had to blow it up. But you can see the different colors, the pink, the blue, and then there's a little bit of yellow, just a little bit. In 1907 through 1909, the Germans came in and excavated. Then after they came in, John Garstang from 1930 to 1936, he did in the red areas. Then Kathleen Kenyon in 1952 to 1958 did her excavations. And she did it completely different than they did. And you can kind of see what she did. She went and took a piece of the pie out and she cut down amongst all of those time layers and just pulled them out and tried to find what she saw. The question that all of these archaeologists had in their minds, the same question we started with: did Joshua fight the Battle of Jericho? Okay. John Garstang in the 1930s excavated with those hopes. And then in the 1950s, Kathleen Kenyon excavated in the 1950s. Garstang earlier relied heavily on the excavated pottery. Pottery, like we talked about last time, it is a timestamp. You can tell what time period it is because of how they made their pottery. And actually, it's getting even better with that electrolysis that I mentioned, talking about the poles that are burned when they fire their clay pots. It's excellent. But anyways, it's getting better. Garstang in the 30s relied heavily on the pottery. But Kenyon, she was not an expert in pottery, and so she completely ignored it. She pulled pottery out herself and didn't do anything with it. She had the idea that because there wasn't any Mycenaean or Cypriot pottery, two certain types that should have been around this time, because she didn't find any, she said, well, it's kind of be the wrong time period. When Joshua and the children of Israel showed up, Jericho was already destroyed, and so were all of the cities in the Promised Land. So the Bible is false. That's what she said. Her argument she made on the absence of an idea, which, by the way, is a terrible thing to do. I don't believe I have $1 million. Well, I don't. But it's not because of the absence that I have. You see what I'm saying? It's a terrible way to make an argument. However, she was respected by many people. And because she said it, everybody took it for word. In main archaeology today, they will tell you, oh no, Jericho was not destroyed by Joshua. There's some similarities, but it was a wrong time period. The pottery that she ignored was vital. And as they're doing it now, they're beginning to see she was flat wrong. She was flat wrong. But she came in the idea, not wanting to believe, and she made facts to prove it. All right. The difference, the way the pottery is manufactured, should have given her a clue of the right time period, but it didn't. Brian Wood, who's also he's an archaeologist, and his study that he got a doctorate in is pottery. And he said it is identical. In fact, Garstang, from the 1930s, he found 5 scarabs from 2 different tombs that were Egyptian. A scarab is just a little marker. and they would have the king, or the pharaoh in this case, on there. 2 of them were from Tutmosis III. 1 was from Hashput. And Hashput is the one that they believe pulled Moses right out of the river. If Kathleen Kenyon was right, those were wrong. But she ignored them. She shouldn't have. Anyways, I wanted to bring those up because if you go to study it, you're going to see that they're talking about Kathleen Kenyon. But again, she ignored much of the facts. Hey, get back there. Now stop. There, that's better. All right. So here's some more things that they found. This is actually the retaining wall, and you can see the stone, but you can also see the dirt layer. That literally how the walls fell and made a path to just go straight up. It was an act of God. In this other, you see these are actually rooms that are inside, and that little cup thing, that's actually a pivot for their doors. That was their hinges. They would put a post down, and it would spin back and forth, which is kind of cool. And you can see it here and then over there. This is actually a tower. You notice that's hollow. They would put food storage in those, and then they could also use them in a battle. They could, shoot arrows and throw rocks and stab and all kinds of things with people in there. But they found all of this when they cut, and she did too. This is actually one of the Kathleen Kenyon's trenches. And you see here, this is that same stone wall, another part of it, but this is the same stone wall that you see. But notice, you see how obviously black that is? Guess what she found in her own research? A whole layer where there was a massive fire. And what she found was that massive fire took place after the walls fell down. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? Almost as if we'd read it. Here's another picture, and you can see some more of the retaining wall and that black burn layer. And this is the other side of that trench. You would think, oh, we've read this before. This picture gives us the answer to the question, did Joshua fight the Battle of Jericho all by itself? This is the picture on the front side, and this is actually, this wall is this wall, but it's looking the other way. This is a house, actually a couple houses. This picture is definitive proof that no, Joshua did not fight the Battle of Jericho, because the commander of the Lord's army did. The question was a trick question. Joshua was there and he did some battling, but this was all God. This is the most dangerous place on a battle. It is literally on the outside of the wall. That house was the first place that would be attacked. And yet, after 3,500 years, that spot still stands. If they were going to tear the walls down in a siege, they would have done them all. If they were going to do everything, why not 1/4 of it? But they didn't. Because it wasn't the children of Israel tearing the walls down. It was that God had made a promise to Rahab that her place would stand, and it did. And it still stands today. This is on the north side of the wall. Like I said, remember these are the... that's the picture that I showed you earlier. If you look that way, you'd see the Judean hills where the spies ran. Exactly what the text says. Here is believed to be Rahab's house. Now we're not sure if this one actually is, because there's several along here that were not destroyed. But it was one of those that stands to this day as a testament that God keeps His word. This is the next thing. When they dug down, they found all of these jars. Do you see that jar? You know what's interesting about that? That is barley. What that tells you is, and by the way, one of the guys that was quoted, one of the archaeologists, said every house that they dug in had jars full of grain. Grain especially during this time, was like gold. You needed it to feed your army, especially if you had 600,000 men. Standing army, you needed a lot of food. All of the grain was still there. What nincompoop of a general would leave all the grain behind? Joshua, because he was told to. What else it tells you is this had to be during springtime because they hadn't even had the opportunity to process it and to put it into loaves of bread and other things because it's barley. All of them were packed. They also had a massive burn layer. It means if there was a massive siege to this massive place and it was as fortified as they said, this food would have been depleted because these people were hungry. But this siege didn't take any time at all, and there was still the food to prove it. 3,000 years, 3,500 years later, stuck in the ground. The scripture tells us that they celebrated Passover right before entering Jericho. This is the time of the barley harvest, the scripture tells us. It fits hand in hand with what the scripture says. By the way, Jericho was the first of the cities to be destroyed in the conquest of the Promised Land. As I mentioned before, God told them to destroy it, to burn it. It was to be a first fruits for him. This is the first celebration of first fruits. What was the other one that we like to celebrate? Jesus. 1 Corinthians tells us because Jesus is our first fruits, because he lives, we also will live. That there will be many to join him. The Bible is so specific. All right. Short siege, plenty to eat, during springtime, massive burn layer. So what does this mean to me? Boy, I've done really well. In closing, I want to answer this question. What does it mean to me? What can I draw from what happened at Jericho for my own personal life today? This is my little rabbit trail. To do that, we have to go 2 weeks prior to the fall of Jericho, to Joshua chapter 2, verse 15. Then she, talking about Rahab, let them down by a rope through the window, for her house was on the city wall. She dwelt on the wall. And she said to them, get to the mountain, lest the pursuers meet you. Hide there for 3 days until your pursuers return. 3 days. Amazing. Afterward, you may go on your way. So the men said to her, we will be blameless of this oath of yours, which you have made us swear, unless when we come into the land, you bind this line of scarlet cord. The word is tikva, in the window through which you let us down. And unless you bring your father, your mother, your brothers, and all of your father's household to your home, so it shall be that whoever goes outside the doors of your house into the street, his blood shall be on his own head, and we will be guiltless. And whoever is with you in the house, his blood shall also be on our head if a hand is laid on him. Spies said, we will keep you safe, but you have to put this scarlet cord outside the window and hang it from this window. If you don't, and you die, it's your own fault. If anybody in your family leaves the house and they die, it's their own fault. If we come in and kill you, then it's on us and God's going to curse us. What's interesting about the Hebrew here, we just see a scarlet, a red rope. That's all it means to us. But there's actually a play on words when you go to the Hebrew. The word is tikva, and it does mean a rope or a cord. But it also is the word in Hebrew for hope. For hope. You probably say, well, Dan, that doesn't make much sense. Why would you have a word that means hope and a word that means cord in the same sentence? Well, picture with me. Go back to the story of Jacob. Jacob, as he's returning, he hears that Esau is coming, and he's terrified for his family. And who does he meet? But this same commander of the Lord's army. He meets God. And he wrestles with him until daybreak. And he won't let him go unless he blesses him. His hope, him holding on, his hope was that he would be blessed. And he wasn't going to let go until that happened. This was Jacob. That was his tikvah. Holding on to God until God blessed him. When you think of a rope, you think of holding on to something, whether it's a cattle trying to be loosed, or you think about the old westerns when somebody goes in and they fall into the quicksand. You heard the jokes that I thought quicksand would be a whole lot worse when I was a kid, because every western had a quicksand where somebody had to be rescued, right? That rope is the only hope that they have of being pulled out, of being saved. Rahab was a pagan harlot. They were moon worshipers, and it's not mentioned, but it's a distinct possibility she was a temple prostitute for the moon god. She's seeing her impending doom. Her house is on the wall and would have been able to see the Jericho, or the River Jordan crossing, and the children, and the spies going up the hill into Judea. She saw her impending doom. And she had hope beyond hope that if she rescued these spies, those people and their God would save her too. Because that was the only chance she had. Her act of putting out that scarlet cord was one of hope for salvation. Hebrews chapter 6, verse 19. This hope we have as an anchor for our soul, both sure and steadfast, which enters the presence behind the veil. You see in your mind the picture of this rope, and it's our anchor. If you want to put it this way, Jesus is holding on to the other end of the rope, and Rahab is holding on for dear life, just hoping beyond hope that Jesus pulls her through. That's hope. It's an anchor that we hold to. Hebrews chapter 11, verse 1. Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. And because of her hope, she's in the same chapter. Verse 31. By faith, the harlot Rahab did not perish with those who did not believe, when she had received the spies with peace. There's a reason, by the way, it's a scarlet cord. Back a few weeks ago, do you remember where they got the scarlet from? The tola worm. Same worm. And there's a whole mental picture that you can see of hanging that scarlet rope out there on the side of the wall as hope, just like Christ does for us. Rahab was holding on to the scarlet cord literally for dear life in the hope of salvation. God didn't just save her, though. God didn't just save her family. He gave her a people. He gave her a tribe and an entire family. Then when you go to the book of Matthew, it talks about her again in verse 5. Because Rahab, after becoming another child of Israel, if you want to call it that, she marries a guy named Salmon. Not salmon, Salmon. For those of you that don't know how to pronounce English. Oh, sorry. She marries a guy named Salmon. Yeah, thanks. But they had a child. Her and Salmon. And his name was Boaz. Boaz marries another pagan named Ruth. Ruth and Boaz have a son whose name is Obed. And Obed has a son whose name is Jesse, who is the father of King David, in the line of Christ. When we hold on for hope, Jesus doesn't just save us. He's got so much more for us. I've got plans for you, great plans that you can't even imagine. I think this fits it pretty well when we're thinking about this cord of hope. I was sinking deep in sin, far from the peaceful shore, very deeply stained within, sinking to rise no more. But the master of the sea heard my despairing cry, and from the waters lifted me, now safe am I. That song is talking about throwing out a tikva, a lifeline for a drowning sinner like me. This is actually a picture. It's kind of cool. I just found it randomly online. And it's a man, and to my colorblind eyes, that rope, when I zoomed in, it had red in it. So I thought it was kind of cool, and I saved it. What I came to find out was this man was on a boat in the Mediterranean Sea with 33 other people, and the boat sank. And there's only 3 people, or a few more, that were saved. And he was swimming for safety. Do you know where he was swimming to? It was so cool. The island of Malta, which, if you know your book of Acts, that's where Paul capsized to. Thought it was really cool, and I was like, oh, that's kind of neat. So I made sure to keep him in there. That line, that lifeline that Jesus throws out, is the only salvation we have. It's our only hope. He's the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. He is our only chance of salvation. That scarlet tikva was Rahab's lifeline. And thank God, as we have seen this week, God's not done throwing out the line, saving sinners drowning, just like you and me. I'm thankful for what's going on in Asbury and then many other colleges. It gives me such hope that God's not done with us yet. He's still faithful. Let's pray together. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for watching. It really does mean the world to me that you're getting a blessing out of it. If this video was a blessing, make sure to hit that thumbs up button for me. That way other people can find it as well. Here in the link section, you'll find playlists and new videos that we put out. We try to do 2 or 3 a week. You can also subscribe to the channel by pressing on my face and then hitting the bell icon, and that will alert you to new videos. May God richly bless you.